One, two, three, and we are live now. Thank you very much for joining in, everyone. This is a very important topic for the country. Data privacy as the way forward for India. And data privacy becomes much more important, we all know, in today's time when pandemic has squeezed in almost 10 years of digital adoption in our lives. This has squeezed in just 1 year. Almost everybody who was not inclined to a digital adoption or trying to use digital tools have been forced to get into those tools being adopted. And of course, the exposure towards the social media, likes of WhatsApp, likes of Facebook, Twitter, and not only those, like the payment from the Bheem to the Paytms and the games which are there, everybody has gone exposed to, and you can use neither of the thing without talking about your own identity, without telling something of your own, whether it is your name, mobile number, or the location, or something else. Since 2010, there has been an increasing recognition by both the government and the public. India needs privacy legislation, especially one that addresses the collection, processing, and use of personal data. The push for adequate data protection standards in India has come both from public and from the industry and industries bodies like DSCI, who regarded strong data protection standard as an integral part of business. Obviously, social medias like WhatsApp and Facebook, as I shared already, are eminent update on its data privacy policies has begun brought this discussion in a forefront to help us understand this issue more deeper and to speak about how we should tackle this as a nation. We have some very eminent panelists with us today. I'm going to introduce Rama Vedashree ji. She is CEO of Data Security Council of India since 2016 and a leader in data privacy as a core mandate of DSCI, and a lot of good work is happening under her leadership. Prior to moving DSCI, Rama ji was Vice President NASCOM, leading all initiatives in domestic IT, e-governance, and smart cities. Another friend is Vishal Gondal, is a founder and CEO of GOQii. He is founding person of the games development and publishing company for India Games, which he sold to a famous company, Digital UTV, which is part of Walt Disney Company in India. And he was MD of that company for 2 years from 2012 and 2013. And he is with us to share his experiences. And obviously, when he deals with the person's policy in games, how does he share everything? We were supposed to be joined with Deepshika. Unfortunately, she could not join. And now we have Aadya Misra. He's a founder of Privacy and Data Hub. She is a GDPR expert and a Spice Root Legal and her expertise in both India-focused personal data protection issues and GDPR compliances. I welcome all of you here, and we are going to start this discussion now. And let me come back straight with a question, Vishal, to you. There are a lot of discussions about personal data today. To set the context, can you help us understand why this is important discussion? As a startup, why is data important to you? What value does each of our individual data give to you and any company, be it WhatsApp or a startup? Over to you, Vishal. Vishal? Vishal, are you able to listen to me?
Sorry, your voice is. I don't know why I can't hear you. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, of course. Vishal, there are a lot of discussions about personal data security today. To set the context, we would like to listen from you the importance of data in our lives. May it be a startup, may it be the companies like WhatsApp or Facebook.
Yeah. Thanks, Ajay, and the distinguished panel here. I'm glad that finally in India we are waking up to the whole idea of data privacy and data security, especially when India has among the highest amount of users online. In fact, more data from Indians are generated and ingested into platforms like Google, Facebook, and all the global platforms which are using our data to profit from it. And I think that's the fundamental challenge right now as a startup, because we are dealing with tons of user data of all kinds. This data becomes eventually the competitive advantage for companies. This is what helps them to create better algorithms, to do better targeting, to do better, let me use the word, to get better outcomes in general. And the more data you have, the better you can do it. However, the challenge of the data is that a consumer is completely unaware of what is happening in this phenomenon. They think that they are using these apps for free, but they are forgetting that it is not the app which is being used for free, but it is their data which is being traded for billions of dollars. And a lot of times, these companies are in direct conflict with the well-being of the users. And I think, what we just saw in the US, when elections could be manipulated with behavior modification, once people were aware of certain preferences of users, they could be targeted and they could be uh, influenced to make certain decisions. So that is one extreme of how data can be used, while the other extreme of data usage is recently the mRNA vaccine. The entire vaccine was actually made without a single virus. It was just a piece of code which was just then inserted into the system. And in fact, they had even simulated the effectiveness of the vaccine by using data models. So there is one end of data which can be used to manipulate election results, and the other is to create vaccines. So I think the key idea here is that how can we, as members of the startup community, work with the government to make sure that there is a framework where this data can be used for good, and at the same time responsibly, because the potential of misuse of this data is immense. And we will talk a lot about that, especially when it comes to the context of healthcare data, which I am personally a lot closely involved with.
Thank you, Vishal. This speaks a lot of importance of each point. And when you link it with the vaccine and today's pandemic, obviously we all can understand the highest importance in the human life. So you are now attaching a data with a human life directly and how it can really impact. So I will go back to Ramaji now. And while the importance has been set with Vishal, obviously as an end user, like all of us together and the millions of in this country, what they should expect when they are giving data to a service provider or to somebody who is using my data, whether it is a medical facility or a social media, and what is the responsibility which is a minimum expectation to the end user from the service providers or tech firms, if may I may say. Ramaji.
Yeah. Thank you, Ajay, and thank you, Ajay and Tom, for having me and the foundation. The first thing I would say is, when you look at platforms and the way everything is getting platformized, whether it is in the edutech side, whether it is in the healthcare and the entire social media, entertainment, right? The amount of personal data and sensitive personal data that gets collected. So I would say anything where there is a big platform which is collecting data and processing. It could be an e-commerce platform, it could be a social media, large global tech company, it could even be a government citizen engagement platform like MyGov, or it could be a huge digital payments platform like UPI, and the healthcare platforms that have come and which have taken a big adoption post COVID, particularly, right? There's so much of sensitive personal data that is getting collected, and I think as a consumer, as a user, or as a citizen, while maybe there is a lot more we need to do to build privacy awareness among the 1.2 billion, Indians, particularly 700 plus who are really, using 750 or 700 million plus who are broadband subscribers plus smartphone subscribers, where so much is happening online, right? And where so much sensitive personal data. I think the first expectation of, there is also one, the regulator side, and then there is a user side. I think the first expectation of the user is that the provider who's collecting my personal data, there is some element of trust that you have with that provider. And it will apply to maybe a small startup who's playing in the area of, let us say, some oncology platform provider, or it could be a very big social media platform provider, right? So, how do you have that trust between the consumer and the provider? And I think the basic expectation now consumers have is that the tech providers who are collecting such sensitive data, they do not do unauthorized use or monetization of that data. I think that's a fair expectation. I think some element of data being analyzed for targeted services or for value added services in an authorized way, I think most consumers would accept that. The second one I think the consumers expect is that because of the data I'm giving to the platform provider, and if that provider or the startup or the big tech firm is breaches the trust I have placed in them, is a harm going to be, inflicted on me? The harm could be because of social stigma. The harm could be because of societal preferences against something. Let us say I'm a young child in a strictly vegetarian family, and I keep ordering non-veg because I have that choice as a young child. Somewhere that gets exposed. There is, I mean, that user has that right to privacy. I'm using a very trivial example, but look at very complicated cases where maybe you may be ordering medicines for mental health, or you may be ordering medicines for some other reason. How does that provider make sure that that sensitive data is protected and is not utilized in an unauthorized way? There is some transparency with with whom are they sharing this data. And if I am saying I don't want this data to be used for marketing by third parties, are they respecting my choice I've given? Is there a way I can withdraw the consent? Some of these look like very evolved, liberal principles, but it is not. I think everybody now begins to understand the value of sensitive data, and the fact that if it is exposed in an unauthorized way, harm can be inflicted. Often that harm could be not just financial loss. When there's a big breach, maybe there are financial losses that happen, but and maybe some, your personal data gets into the dark web. But it's also just, the harm that gets inflicted on you because of perceptions or misperceptions about the user in their peer group, in their society, or in their family. I would say the responsibility and the expectation is this. And given that now privacy is a fundamental right, I think every Indian has a right to expect, whether you're a large government platform, you're a startup, or you're a global big tech firm, they need to respect the user's expectations of privacy.
Very well said, ma'am. And you, Vishal, and you both have taken the data to the touching the points of our real lives, impacted kind of scenarios. And obviously, we all can remember there was a leak of data from a dating site, and that led to many divorces in the real life. It was just a data leak from the perspective of company, but can create havocs in many people's life and whatever it could be. We cannot just imagine. Very well summed up. Adya, I will come to you. And being a privacy professional, what legislation do we as a country have for data privacy? Please enlighten on this. And what are the key principles in these laws? How these legislation are impacting us currently?
Right. So, I mean, it's a fairly expansive question. So I'll do my best to kind of sum up what the legal framework is presently. So India's current data protection and present data protection and privacy rules, they are issued under the Information Technology Act. And these rules were issued in 2011, and they're actually it's time for an overhaul in general, but they have about 5 or 6 major obligations that they impose on companies. So presently in India today, complying with the data protection laws is not very difficult at all. You just need to ensure that you've got individuals' consent when you are collecting their data, and most companies do this, by clicking on that I accept the terms and conditions, I accept the privacy policy. That's a common way for companies to collect consent. Another obligation is that if you are transferring data, right, if you are transferring it to a third party, or if you're transferring the data to a country abroad, you make sure you've got your individual's consent. That's number two. Number three is you have a privacy policy that you publish on your website that informs users how you treat their data. Number four is you've got some information security and cyber security protocols in place, right? So you've actually done perhaps your ISO compliance, you have a documented policy. Suppose there's a data breach, you should, in theory, have the protocols to kind of handle that breach. And finally, you need to have something called a grievance officer. Now, obviously, I am summarizing this and making it seem a lot simpler than it is. But if you look at India's present data protection laws, they are fairly light touch. It's not too difficult to comply with them. You do need to keep in mind that these are the general data protection laws. You also have sectoral laws. So suppose you're a financial institution, you will be governed by the RBI, and the RBI has specific requirements. If you are in the insurance space, you will be regulated by the IRDAI, and you will have specific requirements. If you're in the health space, you are likely going to be subject to more enhanced data protection obligations. So in addition to these general rules, depending on the sector or industry you're in, you will have different requirements. So this is, in a nutshell, what the legal framework is. But you need to keep in mind, and I think Rama ma'am mentioned it, 2-3 years back, the Supreme Court has held that privacy is a fundamental right. So companies, before this judgment, it's called the Puttaswamy judgment that came out in 2017, companies were a little not too concerned about taking their privacy and data protection obligations very seriously in India. But after the judgment, you can just see how courts are treating privacy-related issues. You can see an increased consumer awareness. You can see organizations also scrambling to kind of make sure they are compliant with the laws, right? Because the fundamental right clouds your entire interpretation of the law. So even as lawyers, you will see a lot of lawyers taking a far more conservative approach to privacy right now, simply because there is so much at stake at the moment. So in addition to these existing laws, you do have to keep in mind that privacy is a fundamental right, and kind of approach your privacy practices, keeping in mind that the privacy of your end users, of your consumers, becomes a very, very important part of your data protection compliance process. I do want to touch upon the fact that while this is the present state, the Parliament is in the process of exploring a new upcoming data protection law called the Personal Data Protection Bill 2019. It's modeled very similarly on the GDPR, and it's actually interesting because I think both Vishal and Rama ma'am had mentioned this on some aspect. It's that this is a very harm-based approach to privacy. So you will notice that the penalties under this new law, they're huge. They can go up to 4% of a company's annual worldwide turnover in the preceding financial year. That's a massive risk that companies are putting themselves up for. But it's based on a harm-based approach. So if you cause harm to data subjects, your penalties are kind of measured accordingly. And in addition, it's become a very consent-based approach. Now, at the end of the day, it's kind of giving the power to individuals to ensure that they have consented to your data processing activities. So when the law is enacted, when it is finally enacted, I think it is currently under scrutiny by a parliamentary committee. But once it is enacted, it is going to change, I think, the space of the privacy landscape in India, because there's so much compliance obligations, right, on the government, on companies, on anybody who's handling data in any capacity. So while the existing laws may seem a little light touch, I think most companies, startups included, need to start thinking about their privacy practices very, very carefully. And I'm going to just sign off here because I tend to, go on and on about this a lot. We have also noticed an increase in the type of penalties that are being imposed by regulators, right, for data protection compliance and non-compliance related issues. So you can see courts, you can see regulators like the RBI, taking a far more involved approach to non-compliance with data protection obligations. So just in terms of enforcement proceedings, we are seeing a greater increase in the penalties that are imposed on companies that don't comply with privacy related requirements. So in a nutshell, this is the landscape.
Yeah, it's not nutshell. It's like quite a lot here told, but I'm glad that because there are a lot of companies who are building now companies, they need to be aware, and the matured companies are also part of whatever they are listening, whatever we are talking. So before I go to Vishal or Ramaji, I'm inclined to ask a very simple question to Adya. Very simple, basic question to you.
Mhm.
So, do you think every tech company who is listening right now and otherwise should have a privacy policy in place? That's one question. And secondly, privacy policy having is one thing, and really implementing in the company is another. So, what could be the implication on those smaller companies? I am asking a very layman question, which is useful for everybody who is listening here.
So the answer is, of course, you need to have a privacy policy. You need to have a privacy policy under law, but a privacy policy is important because I think somebody else mentioned it. It's important to educate your data subjects on what you are doing. And the privacy policy is a way of explaining and communicating with your consumer and end user, right? So in answer to your question, absolutely. And as a follow up to that, you need to have the processes to actually comply with what you are promising. So if you are telling your consumers that, listen, we undertake the best practices to protect your data, you jolly well be making sure that you have taken the regular certifications, you've done ISO compliance, etc., right, to actually comply with it. So very simply, yes, please have a privacy policy, and maybe more importantly, please be honest in your privacy policy and make sure that what you are telling your end user, where you are creating that trust and you are helping them allow you to collect the data, is actually truthful, and you have processes in place to kind of keep up with that.
Great use for said those words. Vishal, coming to you, we all deal financial data, and we had lots of discussions in the country about financial data need to be localized, which means that data must be in the Indian geographical boundaries. But there are enough discussions happening on the health data. Why is it important to protect the health data of Indian citizens? You are the best person to speak about this.
So, I mean, just imagine that based on just having your financial data, people are able to create so much profile of users, what are their spending habits, and so on. But the minute that data becomes health data, which is very, very personal in nature, that completely changes the context and even the security threat of somebody. For example, if database about my allergies and my entire healthcare condition is available online, I could be a treated very, very differently by companies who are selling me insurance. I could be treated very, very differently by certain actors who may want to use this data and then misuse it. And especially, I want to give an example. About 2 years back, Strava, a very popular app which people used to do running, a simple app, that data was used by certain analysts to figure out American military bases. Using that data, they were able to extrapolate and figure out that where is the military, and including they were able to even find some of the CIA black spots. So I think now just think about India. Now the device which I am using, the GOQii device, captures 25,000 data points a day if you wear a device like this. And as we know, there are thousands of other Chinese brands now who are having a lot of these devices in the market. While GOQii stores our data in India, right now, people of all kinds, including politicians, military personnel, are using these devices, and this data is not being stored in India and it is going outside. Now, this data can be used for so many purposes, right from figuring out military installations to figuring out what are the specific health conditions which a particular VIP has. And tomorrow they could be even targeted, in all kinds of ways with that, right? So I think the potential misuse of healthcare data is 10 times more dangerous than just the financial data. And the problem right now is because a lot of our data has attributes like Aadhaar. You can even correlate this data because you could get financial data from somewhere else, healthcare data from somewhere else, and start correlating this. So I think one of the big problems, and I know Rama ma'am and Aadya touched upon it, right? While we are okay about privacy policy, but there needs to be strict guidelines on what you can and cannot do with the data. For example, yes, in my privacy policy, I'm saying I'm going to use this data and tell everybody where you are, for example, and people don't even read this and they will just approve it, right? But the reality is that certain parts of this data is so critical, which is why HIPAA, which the American law for healthcare, is very clear that you cannot use personal identification when it comes to any healthcare data. Which means if I am sharing data with any third party, unless there is a specific reason why the person needs to know your name, you cannot even use personal identification. So we are going to that extent, and I think that law is also a little bit dated. I think given what is happening now on the digital side, I think there is an extreme urgency. And I know, so many millions of Indians had installed Arogya Setu app, and Arogya Setu app also collected a lot of data. While that is protected, it's in India, but there are so many apps which are sitting on your Android system which are trying to crawl the data on Arogya Setu also, and sending this data outside India. So I think clearly we need to make sure that the geographical integrity of our data is protected. So clearly, data which is critical, like healthcare data, needs to be stored and processed in India. And clearly, there needs to be a clear definition of why are you using. The purpose is extremely important. And in fact, there could be reasons why you cannot have that as a purpose also in your privacy policy.
Very well, Vishal. Of course, the data remains a very critical. Not everybody can read 200 pages, as you rightly said, and personal identifications and at language and a critical language everybody cannot understand. So obviously, some things, ethical practices, and the policies and the law has to protect the end user. This is what I am hearing from you. But before I go back, I'm inclined to ask your view around a very specific thing about the privacy policy, which impacts the otherwise the end user, not the positive way, which was discussed about the WhatsApp policy. So, would you like to give us your views about the concerns and violations you think that policy gives us to the end users?
See, that's exactly what I said, right? That a lot of times the business models of companies are in conflict with the users. Now, in the case of WhatsApp and Facebook, the problem is that their business model is only about selling your data to people. That's the way they make money, right? And for WhatsApp to make money, unless they decide to charge you for that service, where you are paying for it, so you very well can demand what you want to do with the data. The reality is that their business models are all about selling your data. In fact, I had said on record that when WhatsApp was sold for $17 billion to Facebook, it had not even $1 in revenue. So, what was valued at $17 billion by Facebook? It was the data. And whose data was it? It was mostly comprising of Indian citizens. And Indian government did not make a dollar in tax. While the same thing, if this was telecom, as we know, the spectrum, when it was sold, there was a monetization of the spectrum. So when telecom spectrum was monetized by the country and we were able to have clear guidelines for telecom operators, why is that different the minute we are using the same data and voice services but on the internet protocol? And companies are taking advantage of it. So we are actually losing a lot of money as a country because, like I said, SMS is no longer used. I mean, SMS is only used for sending OTPs right now. That's it. Apart from that, the entire communication protocol has moved to WhatsApp and other platforms. So I would
योगेश
say
आने लगेगा मेरे को.
people need to understand that when things are free, that is not free. There is a lot of value for the data, and that needs to be just like a spectrum that can be easily valued.
Of course, I am now coming to Ramaji. Ramaji, you deal with lots of startups, including the large and the large tech firms, and then give your views to the government also, very credible ones. Very simple language. What should startups be really worried about from the privacy concerns? Is it the compliance issue of trust, or are there any issues which startups should be really concerned in this today's times?
Thanks, Ajay. That's a good question. But I'll just take a minute. Adya very rightly said the current legislations or whatever regulations are light touch. I would say it's light touch, and those light touch ones also apply only to corporates. Nothing applies to public sector agencies. That's another big concern that we have with the light touch regulations or whatever that is there in the IT Act. There are some on the sectoral, but I hope the 2019 bill will get enacted, because even what Vishal talked about, I would say one maybe, I mean, he raised the issue of a concern of data residency. I mean, maybe that's his perspective, but I would say more than residency, having a regulation and enforcement of it, that is a big challenge that we have, I would say, because I mean, we've seen in the peak of COVID in the first few months, so many state governments publishing, all the impacted citizens' data. All the data was residing in India, but have they followed the basic principles of, not publishing such sensitive data, other information? So residency may not be so much of an issue. How much is the enforcement going to happen? Now, to coming to your point, Ajay, I would say first I would spend 2 minutes on what are the challenges that startups have to build a robust system or robust application or a product which hinges on data and its analytic and its innovation. We deal with DSCI particularly, we engage a lot more with security and privacy technology startups. But I also have some visibility to the fintech startups. Just access to data to be able to build a product which is innovating on top of data and providing some niche services. Access to the data is a big challenge because they need data from either large corporates in India like banks or telecom, or they need it from government agencies or the big tech companies which need to be able to provide that data. So I think the biggest barrier that we have is how do we open up data which is either residing in public sector or large India Inc. Companies in telecom, banking, healthcare sector, and the global big tech startups access to data. Particularly, we see when we look at security startups, they can only build their product when they have access to the vulnerability information that is residing in, either the socks of the large banks and telecoms or in organizations like CERTs. The second thing that they definitely need to worry is most of our digital startups, particularly fintechs, health techs, they're not building it only for India. Maybe some of them are very India specific product offerings. They're building, some of them are building it for other geographies, right? Fintech is working in ASEAN countries, or fintech may be working in Europe, right? So, how do they build a product which can meet the evolving privacy regulations? And these regulations are changing by the quarter, by the month, and by the year. New guidelines are coming up. Brazil, Japan, any of them, right? And if you're in the operating for the US geography, at state level now we are having regulations. So how do you build a product? We many of our startups or product companies dealt with this problem when we used to have these sales tax regimes, right? How do you build an accounting product which is continuously evolving with sales tax regulation? It was not a trivial challenge for some of the accounting software companies which have become big unicorns now in India. How do you build that? The second one is the rising expectations of privacy from the user, because you talked about is it good enough to have a policy, because I think the provider, even the startup, needs to demonstrate. How do you demonstrate? It's not just having a policy, right? Putting a policy on a, now it's become a joke that you have a policy. Are you implementing the policy in letter and spirit? Does your consent management really do what it is stating to do? Is there a way that I can withdraw my consent? So how do you meet the user's expectations? While we might say many Indians are not very aware, there is a rising awareness of privacy. Maybe it is at one extreme end in Europe, But I will not say that awareness is not building up in India. It is building up in India. So I would say they are having a double-edged sword to deal with. One is the rising regulatory compliances, whether it is RBI in India or whether it's other financial regulators, healthcare side. On the other side, the user expectations. How do I demonstrate? How do I build the privacy by design principles? How do I get those kind of solution architects and developers who can do that? So I believe they have, but I would say even the third big challenge is access to the data so that they can build the right innovative product, algorithms for anonymization. It's not easy, right? There is a lot of open source stuff that startups do use, but if you really want proper algorithms for anonymization which meet the demanding regulations, you need that kind of technology access and a young startup to be able to develop those algorithms or partner with companies which have that. I would believe that is some of the challenges that are startups. But access to data from big corporates, whether it's tech corporates or user enterprises like banks and telecom, continues to be a big challenge because while we supposedly have an open data policy, I don't think there is enough access to data.
Ma'am, as a follow-up to what you just said, you definitely said the challenges startups face and the tech companies face. Would you like to take a minute and suggest what is the way forward for them to, because they don't have unlimited funds, unlimited resources, as you rightly said, and they have to depend on lots of tools which are available, whether it is made by Google, Facebook, or open source, it doesn't matter. Idea is that you are, we like it or not, we have to be dependent on them, still comply with all the compliances which are required by law here, which may not be in line with those tools. So how does the any startup deal with those kind of situations? What is your right suggestion there?
I would say if we really want to get our startups to really ride the wave of data economy that we keep talking about and saying India will become a $1 trillion digital economy, I think government, large industry should collaborate because ultimately startups are dependent on access to data in between these two things. What is it that government, like in the UK, there's a new policy that has come out where banking sector needs
Yeah,
to open up its data for fintech.
yeah,
So can we look at some enabling, not like a regulations, policies which incentivize and encourage access to data from large corporates and from government? It should be something which is incentivizing.
yeah. Please have glass of water, ma'am. I will
Yeah.
come back to you again. Adya, let me come back to you. And obviously, Adya, we all read the leakages and the vulnerabilities in the big tech firms, and we keep reading that very frequently. So my question to you is, should big techs be permitted to discriminatory implementation of its privacy policy, especially for Indian users, while same policy is not being implemented in other regions of the world? You know what I'm saying?
Ajay, and I think what's going to happen when the new data protection bill is enacted, that is honestly, when I was listening to Vishal and Rama talk, I think most of the answers we seek is within the new data protection bill. Things like localization, things like storage of data, things like transferring data abroad, things like consent fatigue because you have to read so much to accept terms and conditions. All of those things like purpose limitation that I think Vishal mentioned, right? About all of that is very, very clearly set out in the data protection bill. The data protection bill also goes a step forward. It applies to companies that are based abroad that need not have a physical presence in India. And it goes on to impose much more stringent obligations on companies that deal with a lot of data. So, in answer to your question, big tech, just by operating in India and because of the volume of data they process and the number of users they have under the upcoming data protection law, they are likely going to be categorized as significant companies. And because of that, they are anyway going to have more enhanced data processing obligations. So, just by virtue of operating within India, you will be surprised to see that the new data protection bill is going to provide a lot of guidance. It is really going to provide a regulatory and oversight mechanism, provided that, of course, it is effectively implemented. That the Data Protection Authority, when it is constituted, actually does what it is supposed to do. If that is the case, I think that our concerns around big tech, and I'm not going to say that they're going to go away, because that is a problem that the entire world is grappling with, where technology is progressing at a rate that legislation cannot keep up with. But principally, I do think that the answers lie with the parliament quickly enacting the personal data protection bill. Because that is really, I think, regardless of the sector you're in, whether you're in the health sector, whether whichever sector you're in, that is honestly going to be the first step. And do keep in mind, and I think we were talking about things like open banking, etc. There is a lot of developmental changes that are happening in India. I don't know if you're aware, but the non-personal data governance framework that the government, I think, issued in late December, that also calls for mandatory sharing of data to kind of incentivize the data economy in India. You do have the account aggregator ecosystem by the RBI, right? That is kind of enabling individuals to have consent over the data. So there is a lot of development happening. There is, rest assured, going to be enough regulation for big tech. There is going to be enough regulation for government companies and the public sectors in India. There's going to be regulation all throughout the industries. The problem is that right now we quickly need that central law. And then we can look at industry developments, we can look at big tech and say, okay, this is what you perhaps need to comply with. But there's no use looking at them in isolation.
Let's try to solve that problem.
And I think we need, as Aadya is saying, we quickly need the law and we need an authority which is going to enforce it. We need
So,
both.
ma'am, so I would come to Adya and then, ma'am, to you and Vishal both on one question to all of you. And let's have the different answers from all of you. If you have a repetitive answer, you can just skip it. Adya, to you, because they're a legal professional, personal data protection bill seems to be an answer. And that is not in our hands. At least we all four can't do anything about it. This is in a parliament. And
Yeah.
parliament is already in limbo. It's going to take a year or two. We just don't know.
Yes.
If you remember my introductory talk of this panel discussion, we are moving as a digital country very fast. Personal data is already moving into companies' hands, and there
Yeah.
is no protection to that. When there is no law, and this entire immunity will come to those companies about that data which they have procured it before, not after the law. So, how about your mobile number, your name, your location, your address, your medical bills, your telephone numbers, your contact details? All things are already there. So, now what you will protect is a question which will come there, which will be a very small delta, which will be left to be protected after the law. So, now there is a need to me to have a very interim arrangement to get a protection on the personal data. So here is my question to all of you and your views around that. Till the personal data protection bill does not come up, what is the solution to the government of India today? Adya.
So I'm going to sound like a pessimist, but without a law, I think it is really, as a lawyer, right? Like, if I had to advise a company, I would say, please, you have to make sure you comply, use best principles, look at a self-governance framework. Those are mighty goals, those are lofty goals. I think it's important. But very practically speaking, I do believe that without the law, there is, and I'm not being pessimistic, right? I'm being practical. I don't We can look at self-governance mechanisms. That's a great idea. We can have like, for example, within the health sector, you have the National Digital Health Mission, right? So you can maybe have sector specific interim measures within the RBI. Maybe the RBI will come up with something for fintech companies, and they're already doing that in some respect. So maybe we can look at sector-specific obligations. We can perhaps look at self-regulatory mechanisms. For example, OTT platforms come together and say, okay, these are the best practices we're going to follow. But without a law, there is nothing to kind of uphold these requirements.
So
Right.
I was asking the answer around the law, if there is any. Till then, obviously, we know data protection data bill is going to take some
Yes.
time. We all know
Yes.
that.
But Ajay, I do think that the existing data protection rules that exist, light touch, yes, but they do put down the basic principles. So I agree there are loopholes. They don't apply to, for example, to government companies. There is some question about whether they apply to foreign companies, etc. But if you are operating in India, there are existing data protection bills. There are, in some capacity, obligations that you need to comply with. Is that enough? No, but that's a starting point. And maybe what we can do, and we will perhaps see that with higher penalties from regulators. Maybe we will see that with more decisions from high courts and the Supreme Courts, right, where they are enforcing and upholding a fundamental right to privacy. So I think if you look at all these individual pieces of the puzzle, there may be movements. But so, yeah, I mean, if you're looking at it like that, individual silos, that might be the answer in the interim.
Great. We heard the advocate. Let's hear the policy. Ramaji, what is your idea
No,
and thought?
I mean, I would be worried of any interim measures. I think I completely back what Aadya is saying. They should accelerate the enactment of the bill and the DPA and create that enforcement mechanism. Because in the interim, maybe they can just make sure that at least the provisions of the IT Act are properly enforced across state, center, and private sector agencies. Maybe the enforcement can be beefed up, but I think there is no shortcut to not having a national level privacy regulation, because an industry, let's say you have a healthcare and a fintech startup doing both, which regulator will they look at? There's something that RBI will come up with something with, and health is a state subject. What if central health ministry gives some regulation and the state gives a different regulation? I think it will be a nightmare for industry and providers to be able to comply with, such interim measures coming out at a sectoral level. I think we need a national data protection law. I mean, it's already quite delayed, and then the enforcement mechanism and the timelines to be able to enforce it. In parallel, what we can do is, can we step up our capacity building programs around the leadership teams of all organizations, government agencies, so that privacy best practices are incorporated, the gearing up for the 2019 bill. I don't think people have to wait for the bill to be enacted. Even if there are some changes, there is a bill which has gone through so many iterations. 90% of what the privacy legislation is likely to be is known. It's an open secret. It's been there for 2 years. I don't think anything is preventing an Indian corporate, startup, or large company, or even the big tech firm, not to build that readiness for implementing it in India.
Yeah.
I think some organizations are already doing that.
Let's hear Vishal, the gaming and the health professional entrepreneur.
So Ajay, I think the government already has enough mechanisms. The problem is the IT Act, and I think it's quite, at least the new amendment which makes very clear the role of intermediary. Right now, the biggest problem is Google, Facebook, Twitter. They refuse to comply to any Indian laws. They say we are not in India. We are Twitter INC, and we don't want to agree to what Indian courts have to tell us. So the problem fundamentally is data is only going to be later, right? Right now the bigger challenge is none of the foreign companies are even willing to comply with Indian laws. And I think the IT Act, which has been already amended, that is actually a very good starting point, because by law, uh, since these companies don't even recognize Indian law and they are just saying that we don't want to comply, I don't know what data security law and protection law they will comply with. They'll say the same thing, that we don't come under this law at all. That's the entire argument. So what might just happen is all the Indian companies will have to comply with it, and all the foreign companies who are will say that we don't come under the compliance of this law. So I think that's part one. Similarly, I think the act which the Indian government took on the Chinese apps, I think that was a very, very strong statement for India to make. So clearly, there are enough apps which are doing a lot of privacy issues, and we know, for example, there are apps you install them and your entire phone book is transferred without you knowing, or we don't know what all it is transferring, right? There's a lot of challenges on what kind of data apps are accessing. And there are many, for example, there are apps which can third party services which will tell you the risk of these apps, and the Indian government can very well, just the way they banned all these Chinese apps, they can do it. I mean, that's an extreme step, but my point is that there are enough interim measures which can be taken. uh, the problem is that today, and it's really unfortunate, the problem of getting spam calls and SMSs, right? TRAI has set up the regulation, the laws, people have registered as telemarketers, but still it happens, right? So here is an example of a law, a framework, a regulator, but I'm sure all of you including me keep getting those spam SMSs and spam calls selling us bank loans and credit cards every day. So here is an example of something which is data privacy, right? I mean, our data is used, and this is being violated by banks, by large companies. I mean, this is not individuals calling you. There are organized call centers doing that. So I would say that there needs to be, some very, very strict, uh, implementation of the laws. And I would say we should start with the TRAI, and let TRAI set an example first before we want other regulators to do anything.
Yeah, very well said, Vishal. And that's the exact reason why I asked this question from all of you is who get benefited with this personal data protection bill getting delayed? Big tech companies, they are taking the data. Whether it is in India or abroad, it doesn't matter. End user is going to be at suffer. And we are considered inadequate to have our protection data bill. So probably this discussion will take the message further to have this personal data protection bill little speed up and get into force ASAP, and then obviously that becomes a very ruling guidelines for all of us. Thank you for putting up light in this. And we are reaching the last section of this discussion about the closing remarks. Vishal, I will come back to you and let's hear what is the best way to protect an individual's privacy while not impending future innovation. What is your strong thoughts around this? And a lot of startups are listening to you, so you can be very precise.
So I would say that data is, as we say, data is the real gold when it comes to the information age. And just the way how we protect our gold, right? You don't put it outside your door. You are keeping it in a locker, you are keeping it in safety. So I think the problem right now is both companies as well as customers don't understand the value of data. I think there needs to be uh, an awareness and the understanding of the value of data. And once you value something is when you protect it, right? Today I was telling the other day that I was eating, this is of course way before the lockdown, 2019 now. I was eating bhel puri, and that bhel puri was actually being served in a medical report. Somebody's medical report was used to wrap the bhel puri, and that is the state of data today. I'm sure that when you are buying any product, it is wrapped in financial papers and bank papers and medical reports. So because people don't really worry about their own data themselves, the whole thing is happening. So I think this needs to start at the consumer level first, and I think that is going to possibly be the start of the change, because companies are going to find loopholes and they'll always have lawyers who will figure out a way to tell them what to do to comply with something. But the reality is that the repercussions of this is far, far beyond, people are not understanding. But tomorrow, based on your own data framework, there could be so many things targeting against you.
My internet went off in between. There is a big thunder in Jaipur just now, and I just connected from the phone. Sorry for that. Vishal, I hope you have answered. I could not listen, but must be audience must have heard you. Ramaji, I would come back to you. How do we prepare our tech entrepreneurs for an age where, obviously, as Vishal said, data becomes a very important and system that's gold and a precious resource to be carefully handled. So, how do we prepare our very young generation who is not just dealing with the current challenges but also trying to build huge innovations around AI, ML, which is purely on data? What are your suggestions to them?
I think the first thing would be is that any provider, a digital startup or a large company, I think should not have this tick in the checkbox kind of a compliance approach to privacy. I think if they can have a user centric approach to the privacy principles, they will follow. And some transparency in what they're doing with the data they're collecting. I think a user, as long as you're transparently communicating what you're doing with the data, right? Even if you're sharing it with a third party for some value added services or for analytics, I think if there is some transparency in this and the user gets to know what is the benefit he or she is getting out of that, I think a user will be still okay with it. So I would say don't have a compliance mindset. If you can respect the user and the user's privacy and design a user centric privacy policy and an implementation and consent management in your product, and be transparent about what you're doing there, and it should come right from your developer, solution architect to the founders.
Wow. And ma'am, related to the preparedness for personal data protection bill, any suggestions here? Do you think we should start looking at this bill in the current form and getting ready for that, or should we wait for this to pass?
No, I think any tech startup or a digital startup already, I would not say they don't do it. I think it's not fair. A lot of them do implement privacy best practices. Is there a way we can step up that so that they know what can they do in terms of implementing privacy right from the design stage in their coding principles, including giving attention to security, because often their obligations might start when there is a security breach, which may also result in a privacy breach. So, how do they do that secure by design and privacy by design principles? And look at the 2019 act, because already our tech startups, many of them do understand their obligations from the EU GDPR or the California Privacy Bill. Most of our startups are aware of their privacy responsibilities. Can they look at the 2019 version, and as they start thinking of the new products, build those products to be able to meet that? And when the final act comes up, there will be some incremental changes. I'm sure they can tweak their products.
And the last, Adya, to you, your experience with the learnings related to GDPR, what we can learn, good or bad things, which we should avoid and which should adopt in our personal data protection bill or as a country, and maybe some advices for end users, and also some light on while the end user is giving away the data to the companies, is there something which end user can do to restrict not to give that data under the principle of law, under the natural justice, under some protection? I don't know what are the things which are available to the end user, but your learnings related to GDPR and some advice for the end user to protect their data.
So, with respect to end user protection of data, I think I'll take that first. That is interesting. I think one is, of course, awareness, understanding how companies, process your data. I think in the absence of regulation, there is an added step on individuals to go the extra mile to understand how companies process your data. That becomes important. I do want to mention that with consent-based regimes, right? With the new law that is going consent-based, even existing Indian law, but existing Indian law has a massive loophole. Is that you have the power to tell companies that no, I'm not going to give you my data, or I'm not going to give you XYZ category of my data. So, for example, if it's a ride-sharing app, why do you need my location after I've left the cab, for example, right? In such cases, today, companies in India have the ability to deny services. So they say, if you don't give me your data, I'm not going to provide you with services. That, under the new law, is going to go away. So individuals will automatically have more of a choice, have more control. There's also examples, and you can see companies doing that right now, acting as consent managers. So they're going to be tech interfaces that help individuals control their data a little more. They can say, okay, I'm going to give you XYZ data because it's important and I need this product, but you don't need ABC category of data. So I do think that with consent-based architectures, individuals are going to have more consent. But a lot of it in the interim comes down to individuals going that extra mile. That's number one. In terms of the GDPR, and I can go on and on about this, but I do think the most important thing when you're looking at Europe is that you need to have a sensible, reasonable, and efficient data protection authority. Right, because everything under the new law comes from an effective implementation. The DPA, once it's constituted, is going to kind of lay out how the law is going to be enacted. So I know it seems like, the burden is on companies, and yes, it is, but the burden is equally on the data protection authority to kind of really be efficient, keep up with best industry practices, keep up with technology advancements to see how best the system can be designed for India. With the GDPR, I mean, they did have 2 years to comply with it. So the regulation came out in 2016. Companies had 2 years to comply with it. And I'm hoping that in an Indian context as well, there is enough time for companies to kind of put their heads together and figure out the best form of compliance.
Wow, well said. I think this panel can continue for another few hours, but we always close this in an hour, and this is the top of an hour. I would like to thank Ramaji, Vishal, and Aadya, all of you, for your valuable time, valuable input. There's a lot I have learned, and I am sure every listener has learned from here. Thank you very much for joining ADIF session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay, and thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
See you, Adya and
Thank you
Vishal.
very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.